first one I gave, I spoke to Grand Rounds, which is hi, Brennan. Hi. The first one I spoke to, Grand Rounds at the University of Nevada Medical School, which is where all the medical students get together in a room and you lecture on a medical topic. So I was lecturing on the science and some of the neurobiology of antidepressant and psychiatric drug withdrawal. And so it was a very academic talk, and there was a lot of nerd speak and stuff in there, and it was very, very clinical. And then 2 weekends ago, I was on an expert panel on the topic of medicating normal. So it was myself, Pulitzer Prize finalist Robert Whitaker, who runs a website called Map America. Also, Dr. Raghu Appasani, who's a psychiatrist, and David Antonuccio, who's one of the leading researchers on antidepressants, and maybe they're not totally fully forthcoming in what we've been told about antidepressants, how they work, and what the pros of them are versus what the actual cons are, some of the corruption that's happened in big pharma around them. He's one of the leading researchers there. Myself, we were all on a panel. That was a really big room, about 300 people. It was a very, very, very difficult event for me to be at because it was a lot about my personal story, and it was really intense and sad. And I walked out of that room just feeling like completely just exhausted. And so I'm actually really excited that we have a smaller group of people here today, because I find that, especially with the hour we have, I want to make a lot of space for questions. You're all obviously here for a reason. Nobody shows up to an event like this at 12:30 on a Wednesday or Thursday, whatever day it is, if there's not a reason. So I want to make sure I make a lot of time for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you just a little bit of the background of my story. Why in the world the chef is sitting here talking to you about this, because I know that's a very confusing thing. I'm not a doctor, not a researcher, so why am I the person here? And then we're going to go immediately into questions, and I think that the questions you guys have, if you have them, if you don't, I'll stop for now. But assuming you have some questions, that will inform where this conversation can go. So think about that. It didn't occur to me that maybe we should have a way to anonymously ask questions. If for some reason you need to do that, I don't know, we'll figure it out, but I also trust that anything that is said in here at least won't be shared publicly by me, so feel free to keep things anonymous or just general if you're concerned about saying something private.
I'll grab some paper.
Oh, yeah. So again, my name is Brooke Siem. I'm 38 now, and that's relevant because when I was 15 years old, my father suddenly passed away, and I was put on a cocktail of antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs, and by the time I was old enough to vote, I was on 6 different medications. 2 of them were psychiatric drugs, and 4 of them were given to me to counter the physical side effects that happened from the antidepressants. But at the time, we didn't really know that those antidepressants were creating physical side effects in me. It wasn't, medicine is so compartmentalized. It's in such silos that the fact that I was having thyroid problems, nobody connected that to the antidepressants, so the endocrinologist put me on thyroid drugs. So on and so forth, I ended up on a cocktail of six drugs. You know, I went about my life. I got into college. I went to Middlebury College in Vermont, got a degree, moved to New York City, went to culinary school, started working in the culinary industry. All this time, my medication was not changed. It was not altered. No professional of any kind. 3 different states, doctors in 3 different states. Nobody questioned what I was on. No pharmacist questioned what I was on. It got to the point in New York City where I saw a GP, and he was the one who prescribed me all my drugs. And about 4 years in, after I'd been seeing him for 4 or 5 years, I called him for, my annual refill all my prescriptions for a year. And he looks at his chart and he says to me, "Oh, I just realized we never did a physical. We should probably do that." So I've been getting a constant stream of any drug I wanted for 4 straight years without even having a physical by my doctor. This was all covered by insurance. Now, if the drugs were working and I was happy, perhaps there's an argument to be made that this wasn't a problem, but I was getting more and more depressed, more and more suicidal, to the point where when I turned 30, I was kind of just done mentally and emotionally, and I didn't really want to do it anymore. But when I was 30, it also finally dawned on me for the first time that if my antidepressants were working, I shouldn't be feeling this way. And that was a revolutionary concept for me to think about, and for it to finally dawn on me at 30, because for so long I had thought that if I'm not on these drugs, I'm only going to be worse. That's what I had been told. I'd been told that I had a chemical imbalance, that it wasn't my fault, that there was something wrong with me, and these drugs were akin to giving insulin for diabetes. And so that's how I thought of it. So it never dawned on me that the drugs themselves might actually be contributing, or that there was something else going on here that perhaps I had control over or could fix somehow. So around the same time, I got this bizarre opportunity to travel around the world for a year. And I kind of won this weird little lottery, sort of, and the idea was that me and 70 strangers were gonna get on a plane, and we were gonna travel to 12 countries in 12 months. And at the end of that year, we just would have done this thing. And I did not think that I was going to get chosen. I was a little drunk when I applied, and just was like, whatever, and then ended up getting chosen for it. And I realized, okay, well, if I'm gonna take this trip, which at that point, I was so miserable in my life in New York, I said I have to take this trip, right? Because I'm not going down a path here that is gonna end well. So I may as well take this trip and see what happens. But I realized I physically can't take these drugs in my suitcase. It's not gonna happen. I can't take a year's worth of supply in one suitcase. I also couldn't trust that I would be able to refill these drugs all around the world, because we weren't going to London or Paris or places where I could really trust the pharmaceutical system. I was going to be on an island in Thailand or in Cambodia or in the middle of Croatia in January. And so all that said, I went and I saw a psychiatrist, and I told her what was going on. And she said that she didn't recommend me getting off my drugs. And I had to basically fight her and talk her into just like telling me what to do. And at that point, I was on 37.5 milligrams of Effexor XR, 150 milligrams of Wellbutrin XL, and the 4 other drugs. And she said, well, you're on the lowest dose of Effexor XR on the market, so just stop taking it. Like I can't prescribe you a lower dose. And I asked her if I would, feel kind of weird. She's like, yeah, you may have some withdrawal effects. You might feel like you have the flu for a few days, but it'll be fine, basically. And so I listened to her. I followed her advice and stopped taking it, and within 5 or 6 days, I was having symptoms that could have gotten me institutionalized had I admitted what was happening. But I didn't admit what was happening because I knew that if I told her what was going on with me, she would put me on an involuntary psychiatric hold. She would be worried that I was at risk to myself or somebody else, and I would be put in a mental hospital and likely shot up with all sorts of other psych drugs, simply because I was having a withdrawal reaction to a common antidepressant that I was told was safe. So instead, I called a family friend who's a psychologist, and she kind of talked me off the ledge and assured me that what was going on was connected to the medication. And I didn't know how long this was gonna last, so I got mad enough that I was able to really just kind of say, okay, well, we're not gonna go back on anything else, we're just gonna hold out. But I ended up having about a year of severe antidepressant withdrawal that extended to 2 years where it was less severe. And the experience was so bad, I got a book deal out of it. So I wouldn't recommend it. This is not the way you want to get a book deal, but the point of it is that the time this was happening to me, it was 2016. The first systematic review of antidepressant withdrawal, so basically not the first time it appeared in the literature, but the first time someone said, let's look at the literature and see where withdrawal has been mentioned. That happened in 2015, and this happened to me in 2016. So there really was almost no research, there was no reporting on antidepressant withdrawal, and on top of that, every single study that had been done on antidepressants up until that point in time never considered antidepressant withdrawal as part of a negative side effect of being on those drugs. So that means that every single study, every single piece of research that everything you've ever heard about antidepressants is based upon does not include withdrawal. So therefore, anyone who dropped out, we don't know if it was withdrawal or if they just were a non-reactor. People who were switched from drugs to drugs and would have symptoms, they'd just kick them out of the study. People who relapsed is the word, but they never considered withdrawal as what was happening. And so all of the science that this is built on, and that doesn't even get into whether or not the science itself was corrupt to begin with, never considered withdrawal. So there's nothing about it in the literature, there's nothing about it in this culture, and yet we have hundreds of millions of people around the world on these drugs who are starting to look around and say, it's been 10, 15, 20 years since I've been on them. I can't get off of them. What's the problem here? So that's why I was able to get a book deal on the subject, even though I'm not a doctor, even though I'm not a researcher, because I was able to write it from this experience of this is what happens, this is what can happen during withdrawal, this is what it feels like, this is how we identify it, this is how it can stop being misdiagnosed as relapse, bipolar, schizophrenia, paranoid disorder, whatever might be coming up. This is part of how clinicians can recognize it. It's how patients can feel less alone. It's how family members can support it. And right at the same time, I think the culture is starting to change a little bit, because then in 2018, there was a big article that came out in the New York Times about how people are having trouble getting off their antidepressants. And 2020 hit, things went like, I think we were on a good trajectory, and then 2020 hit and all the telehealth companies came up, and then it was just like, oh God, now let's just put everybody on these drugs. Then people started to get concerned about it. My book came out in 2022. I've been doing press and talking about it since then, and I do feel like there is a little bit of a culture that is starting to change around this topic, but it's still tricky. I get yelled at on the internet a lot. But here we are. So that is my story. That's how I am the accidental face and advocate for this topic. I've had to educate myself on the science, but again, it's to the point where now I'm talking to doctors at universities about it. So just because I'm not a researcher and MD doesn't mean that I don't have the scientific language and breadth to talk about this stuff. And so I'm gonna stop here and see if there's any questions to start. I'm assuming that there will be more questions as we go through, but if there's any questions right now, I'm gonna stop, and if everyone's silent and just staring at me, I will keep going. So we're gonna start there.
And if you have a question that you've written down, I'm happy to ferry it to
Yes.
friends.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions and you want to give them to Nova because you don't want to say
Pass
something
them
publicly,
down the aisle.
feel free to send it to her. And if nobody has any questions right now, oh yeah.
So I had a similar experience. I was put on a bunch of different antidepressants, SSRIs, when I was between the ages of like 15 to 17. And I was just having like really, really bad reactions to it. Like, it didn't matter what the drug was or the dose, but I would like literally have like hot sweats.
Yeah.
And just like my body was physically rejecting the drug. And I was like obviously in therapy during that time as well. And on the other side of it now, like they diagnosed me with like pretty severe diagnoses at the time. And in retrospect, I feel like there isn't a big enough distinction between like circumstantial like behavior and feelings, and then like actual like a biochemistry issue.
Yeah.
So do you think that there's like a conversation coming soon, or have you heard a conversation about the differences between a circumstantial diagnosis and like an actual like science-based diagnosis?
Okay, that's a great question. Okay, so I think that there's something called the biosocial the biopsychosocial theory of depression, right? Or mental illness in general. And the idea is, it sounds kind of nice in theory that like all these, mental illnesses or whatever, and I'm using mental illness, mental health as a very, very blanket term, in part because that's what culture and society is asking us to do, which is also a big part of the problem, right? So the idea is that you have the biological side of things, which is really what the pharmaceutical companies have latched onto, right? Like, you guys are younger than me, but have you all seen the Zoloft blog, the SAD blog? It came out in, everyone's nodding, right? It came out in the mid-90s. It was like this little happy blog, like, oh, depression is probably caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. And then there's a little chalkboard drawing of these little neurotransmitters going back and forth, and it's like, Zoloft corrects that imbalance. And then the blog gets happy. There's no science, there's no basis for this at all. We can talk about the origins of that theory. It started with syphilis, which is interesting, and somehow ended up in pharmaceutical marketing and advertising. But that's the bow. That's what everybody really wants it to be. That's the way we can say, like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. It's just the way I was born. It's something that happened. It's just shitty luck. Here's the easy solution. Go on with your life. And so that's why pharmaceutical companies have been able to latch onto that narrative. They can't latch onto the psychological narrative or the social narrative, right? They can't say, let's fix your socioeconomic status, or the fact that you're in an abusive household, or the fact that you were abused as a child, or your dad died, or whatever was going on at 15 for you or me, right? They can't latch onto that and fix that with chemistry. So the biological narrative has really, really, really taken over. Again, the problem is there's no basis for that. You've been in office and you've been prescribed these drugs. Does anyone ever take your blood to tell you what level of depression you had, right? How many parts per million bipolar do you have, right? None of this, we can't measure it. Some people will start to say, okay, what about the genetic component? And it's like, well, again, there's no genes that have been identified but for this, there are some research who said, well, there's a collection of around 100 genes that are involved. But tell me how this is practical for the 1 in 4 people who are on these drugs. It's not, right? None of us have been through that testing because it doesn't exist. So we've spent, I think it's over $2 billion. It's either $1 or $2 billion. Once you get into the billions, it's a little irrelevant. Over the past 50, 60, 70 years, trying to find a biological explanation for this, it hasn't been found. That tells me that either it's so complicated we are unlikely to find a simple answer for it, or that's not really the problem, and we're really looking at a more psychosocial, cultural phenomenon here. That doesn't necessarily mean that I think we should stop research. I think science is great, let's keep doing it. I think we need to understand the difference between independent science and pharmaceutical-backed science, right? Because the pharmaceutical companies are very much invested in having you take their drugs. And there's a lot of problems in the whole way that these drugs are approved by the FDA. We only have to get 2 studies that show a positive outcome to get a drug approved by the FDA. The thing is, it doesn't matter if there's 98 failed studies that never were submitted. So what does that tell you, right? If you start digging into the literature through the Freedom of Information Act, you can see how many studies never really worked out, and that's just the ones that are public. There's all the ones that never made it out of the research, never make it. But once you start pulling at those threads, the narrative really starts to unravel. So as far as what's coming down the future, what I'm really seeing in the world is kind of like, I don't know if you guys remember the K-shaped economy that was being described after COVID, about how the way COVID hit people is you had people who were already wealthy, who were able to get wealthier and more secure, and the people who were insecure were actually going to get less secure, and the middle class kind of evaporates. That's what I'm seeing in the world of mental health right now, in the world of psychiatry, medicine as a whole. There is a huge push that's largely patient-driven, basically starting to sound the alarm, saying that Prozac has been on the market since the late 1980s. We've been medicating kids now for decades. People are starting to become adults. They're coming of age on these drugs. They've been on them for such a long time. They're not better, they're worse. There's something, everybody else is getting worse. Suicide rates are going up, mental illness rates are going up. There's something that suggests that what we're doing is not working, right? So there's a large component of both researchers, doctors, and also patients who are like, we need to change course here, going one direction. There's this other situation that's happening at the same time of people who are getting captured largely in lower socioeconomic statuses. It's a horrible problem in the foster care system. A lot of students, now people can just go on telehealth companies and they can have a shitty 10-minute appointment with some nurse practitioner in Iowa and say, I can't pay attention, and they've got a lifetime prescription of Adderall, or I'm sad, and there's a lifetime prescription of an antidepressant, and there's no follow-up, there's nothing happening there. And then they're able to be fully captured even further by the cultural zeitgeist that is World Mental Health Awareness Day, which is today. And all the anti-stigma groups, which again, if you start pulling back the veil on all of that, they're founded by pharmaceutical companies in order to promote drugs. But nobody knows that, then you can't talk about it because you get yelled at on TikTok or whatever the hell it is. And so it's these 2 things happening at once, which is really interesting. And what I think that is really asking us all to do as individuals is to take some control in your own health, start doing your own research. You guys are all smart because you're in a university, you clearly have brains that are pretty highly functioning. So take that very smart brain you have and start applying it to your own life and your own research and the things people are telling you, because once you start understanding where the information's coming from, it gets real jumbled. So that's where I think we're at. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but the TLDR of this is there are still no biological markers for any of these mental illnesses, including schizophrenia. Oh, and I'll come back to something else I think somebody else was alluding to maybe with the umbrella. And also, there's so much of the circumstantial And so kind of based on that again, part of the other problem here is that there are antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs, which are, you got your benzo class there, and mood stabilizers. Those are roughly the 4 classes of drugs that are used to treat any sort of mental distress. So the amount of people I know who had a depression diagnosis that's circumstantial because their dad died or they got broken up with or whatever, who are also on an antipsychotic that's the same antipsychotic that's supposed to be given to someone who had a psychotic break when they were 13, why are they on the same drug? Like, that in itself should tell you that the biological nature of this is really unfounded, because these are two very different expressions of trauma and biology, if we want to say that. The biological thing is tricky, but why are they on the same drugs? And yet it's so common. So there's just not a lot of nuance, and because there's no testing, we can't say like, oh, you're really schizophrenic, but you're just having a reaction. There's just no way to, it's all self-reported. All right, what's next? I see a lot of nodding.
Further thoughts or reflections?
What?
I was just calling in further thoughts or reflections.
Yeah.
So if like your symptoms are getting worse on the medication, why is it that they just kept prescribing you medication instead of being like, hey, is there something else that we could do besides just like this cocktail of medication?
Are you asking about me personally or in general? Why that?
Or like in general, or like your experience as well, if you're
Yeah.
sure.
So, I mean, a lot of this is because, so there's something called standard of care in medicine, which is that you have to follow the rules of what the medical community has dictated as standard of care, which is really actually because of the insurance companies, right? Like, so in the DSM, that's the Diagnostic of Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, came out. DSM-3 is kind of the one that really changed mental health. I think there's an argument to be made that it is the most important book in history in the way it has changed society. Not necessarily for the better, but there's an argument to be made there. It has changed the way we view human suffering, which is not a small thing. That's the first time that we started to really get like hundreds of different mental diagnoses put into a book with a collection of symptoms. There was about 8 men in a room who decided like, oh, we're gonna put that into the depression box, and that into the anxiety box, and that into the borderline box, and this into the schizophrenic box. And yeah, they kind of overlap sometimes, but if you have 5 of these symptoms out of 8, then we can technically, say that you have this thing, right? So they kind of categorized it. And in a lot of this conversation, it's very difficult to delineate the difference between what was well intended and got out of hand, and what is corruption, or more evil, or conspiracy, or shitty, And I think that with the DSM, they're kind of, part of the reason why it was created was in order to give practitioners common language. But then when you start layering policy and insurance on top of that, okay, well, we have insurance getting involved now. The only way for insurance to bill or the only way for a clinician to bill insurance is if they have a code for it. The only way to have a code is if it's in the DSM. So there's no code for you're 15 and your dad died. There's code for depression. So they can get reimbursed for treating someone with depression, but they can't get reimbursed for her dad died and she's having a hard time, right? Now, the treatment for depression, the standard of care treatment, is an antidepressant. So in order to not get sued, in order to get reimbursed, in order to keep the insurance companies happy, they have to say that, okay, we've given them the option of an antidepressant, or we've prescribed an antidepressant because this is what you are supposed to do as a good doctor. There's no way to get reimbursed for give her time to grieve. There's no way to get reimbursed for go exercise, go outside. It doesn't matter that the literature will say that exercise, meditation, talk therapy is just as effective, if not more effective, than antidepressants. Irrelevant. It's antidepressants, or whatever the appropriate drug is for the class. That is the standard of care. So that's why that didn't happen. Now, this is also a two-way street, right? Like, I was 15 when I was first put into therapy and first put into the world of mental health. But I turned into an adult, and it was my choice to go in there every couple months and say, I still want this drug. Now, some of that has to do with the time and place. I had been bombarded both through language and through action since I was 15 that there was something wrong with me and that I needed this. There was no reason for me to think independently about it because this is what I had been told, especially at that age when you're so valuable, right? It's one of the reasons why I'm so deeply against and cautious about medicating kids, because if you tell an 8-year-old that they need a drug in order to sit through school or whatever it is, you are effectively telling them there's something wrong with them and that they are not capable of navigating life on their own. And they have no agency in that because they're 8. If a 28-year-old decides to go see a psychiatrist and decides to take any sort of psychiatric drug or amphetamine or whatever they're doing, I'm quite sure they're not being fully informed on the subject, but at least they're 28. They've had time to fully bake. They're making that choice for themselves. It's not being made for somebody else. But for me, because it was made for me, then I just grew up through this lens of something is wrong with me. So it never occurred to me to tell the doctor that, oh, I'm feeling worse. And also, if I had, they just would have increased the dose. Like, again, because that's what they're trained to do. They're not trained to look at a holistic person. I'm also seeing them maybe once or twice a year for literally 5 minutes, because that's what insurance will cover and that's how they're rewarded. And so it's not that, I mean, I had some seriously actual bad doctors. I had one doctor who tried to diagnose me as bipolar through a videotape. I'm not kidding. She sat me in a room, put on a videotape, an old VHS tape that was like an hour of, do you sometimes feel happy and sometimes feel sad? Like, yes, no, a little bit sometimes. Circled thing, and then she looked at my little form with all my circles and was like, I think we need to watch this come back. Like, I saw her for 5 minutes. Like, she was horrible. I don't understand how this was even, like, legal. Probably wasn't. But I also had doctors who tried, and I wouldn't talk because I was pissed off. I didn't want to be there. I hadn't fully processed everything I'd been through because I was medicated. And so part of it has to do with the questions that are being asked. Like right now there is a really big, not a really big push, I wish there was a bigger push, but I'm sure you've all heard of the 988 line that made some splash within the past year about basically the suicide hotline. This is kind of an example of one of those things that seems really well intentioned, but I'm not actually sure that it's a good idea, in part because the amount of police intervention that goes up when people call this line is pretty nuts. But the other question that's not being asked when people are calling this hotline is, are you taking any psychiatric drugs? Because most of the time, people probably are, right? But these drugs can induce suicidality, they can induce suicidal thinking, it's even drug changes, like just going from one dose to another. But nobody's asking that question. So what's happened is somebody calls, they're having a hard time. The context of this is, oh, we just upped my Zoloft from 25 milligrams to 100 milligrams, and now suddenly I'm having suicidal thoughts. But all we hear is you're having suicidal thoughts, and then the police shows up at your door and they take you to a mental institution and your whole life has changed. And again, these are things that we all know this, right? We've listened to the commercials, we've heard things like you gotta watch out, there's a black box warning on these drugs, but people don't think it happens to them, and then they also don't realize it because it's slow. It's subtle, right? So you ask why I didn't say anything? Because this was an insidious thing that happened over time. I was 15, I was just starting puberty when I was medicated. My entire body and brain developed on these drugs. So at 26, when I've been on them for 10 years, how am I supposed to then delineate what's me and what's the drugs? I don't know the difference. I thought it was normal. I thought it was just me. And none of the doctors are trained to ask the right questions or to spend enough time with someone to actually get a little bit to the bottom of what could be going on.
Brooke, I have some questions here. I can't see if there's other hands in the audience, though.
Sure.
So these are kind of anonymized questions. So what of the people who respond well to SSRIs and other such drugs, does it matter that the science does not know why if it works? So does not know why it works if it works.
Okay, so if we're gonna just beat the science drum here and see like what does the literature say, there are a couple of important things to consider here. The first one is that roughly, according to the literature, it's about it goes into thirds. Roughly 1/3 of people are considered like good responders on antidepressants. 1/3 are non-responders, as in it's neutral, like you're kind of nothing good, nothing bad. And roughly 1/3 have problems. So what does that tell us, right? It tells us roughly 33% of people are positive responders of the people on the drugs, 66% aren't. So that math is not great to begin with. But let's say, it's also very different from the math we've all been told, right? Okay, but now, and I believe that's Davies and Reed, I think that's the author on that. I can double check the author if anybody has specific questions about where that research comes from. But let's just focus on our 33% for a second. If we look at that 33%, the next question is why? Why are these 33% of people doing well? And biologically, we have no clue. Absolutely no clue. We don't know. Now, there's a ton of research around the placebo effect. There is a researcher named Irving Kirsch out of Harvard who's basically dedicated his entire career to the placebo effect in general, but he has also done a ton of research on antidepressants. And his research suggests that there is a huge correlation between placebo effect and antidepressant efficacy. So to the point where, again, if we say 33% are are positive responders, when you add Kirsch's research into it, it takes that number of 33% down to about 15%. That only 15% are actually having a net positive reaction to the antidepressants as opposed to the group who are having placebo. Okay, so now we've just brought this down to a little group of 15%, right? So now we've got 85% of people are either having a placebo effect, no effect, or bad effect. And yet we have hundreds of millions of people around the world on these drugs. Okay, so now we're into the 15%. Great, 15% of people are having good reactions on these drugs. Awesome, like if that's you, fantastic. Consider yourself very, very, very lucky. However, there's still questions to consider here. The first one is, there's no long-term clinical studies about the effects of antidepressants at all. Most of the research studies are between 4 and 12 weeks. Sometimes you get some follow-up studies that can maybe extend to about 2 years, but there's not a single piece of research that is gonna go beyond 2 years, basically. So once you're past that mark, you're kind of in the Wild West. So what can tend to happen for people is that maybe they have a good reaction, or they think it's a good reaction within the first, let's say year, maybe 2 years. And then over time, they start to do worse. Or they start to kind of plateau, or they start to go downhill. And then after 10 years, they're really not doing well, and they don't know why, right? They haven't been told that these drugs were designed for short and medium term, not long term. And so if you are someone who's been on those drugs and you feel like they're working and you're in that 15%, that's all well and good, in my opinion, as long as you've also been given true informed consent about the nature of them, the fact that 10 years down the line, they might not work as well and you're gonna need to have another conversation. Also, has anyone talked to you about how to get off of them? Because presumably, most people's conditions are circumstantial, even if they're big ones. Like if you've lost someone important to you, you could be in a state of grief for 5 years. That's completely reasonable, right? But if you no longer want to be on the drugs anymore, well, then we actually have no real support or not enough literature on how to take you off of it safely. And then you might end up having a problem. So I don't know if that really answers the question. It's just kind of like, one, not as many people are doing well on them as we think. And also, even if you are in the group that is doing well, we don't know why, and that does not necessarily preclude you from having the information about getting off of them safely or the lack of long-term research on the topic.
Presume that answers the first question.
Yes, we've got about 25 more minutes just for context. Yeah.
I'm very impressed with what I've had so far. I grew up in a different part of the world where
Where are you from?
Nigeria,
Ooh.
but I've been here like over 30 years. What I've had to say so far echoes how I've thought about this subject for a very long time. But I only talk about it with people I'm close to.
Yeah, I get that.
Friends. And the fact that this room is not packed today to only affirms what I've always imagined, why we can't break out of this cycle that you're talking about.
Yeah.
think, what I hear you talk about is a structuralist critique of how our society functions. There is hyper commodification of the drugs. And I wonder even if some of our institutional personnel here on campus and many other campuses are wary of giving the platform to someone like you, because the tools that they've configured since I started in this teaching racket, it's about, I don't know, 25 years or so, it's very one-dimensional, very limited. And your perspective seems quote unquote radical. So I wonder, what I hear you doing is trying to empower students, patients, and citizens. Maybe if you include that in your titles, maybe the activist-minded among us, will feel free, and maybe some of our institutional personnel will find a good, capsule to put your kind of work in, because right now everybody is just like almost like zombies.
Oh yeah.
In dealing with this subject, I used to think it was a case of people being comfortably numb. Those who are on the medication and those who claim to support them. But I'm finding out that folks are actually in pain still.
Yes.
Which is why I showed up, because of the first person description of your talk.
Yeah.
So are there other folks like you? You guys making a documentary? Are you finding other avenue through which we can, give your perspective a broader outreach?
I'll write a few things down in part because I really want to say something about this and then forget it and on paper here. So the first thing is I'm so glad you brought up kind of this more global aspect of it, because one of the things that I feel like falls apart really quickly in the world of the biochemical narrative about this is just biology or genetics is that if that were true, it would have to be true across time and culture. So if evolution doesn't happen fast enough for in the past 25 years for us all to have like mentally broken, right? That's not how it goes. No, thank you. That's not how it works. So if the other thing I was gonna write down again, just a little bit. Okay. Medicating Normal is a documentary. I'm not in it, but I do a lot of work with them. It's available on Google, you'll find it. It talks a lot about this stuff. There are a couple of other smaller documentaries that have been made, but that's documentary. So, but the time and culture thing I think is really important. So if we think about cancer, right? Like let's say we pull a tumor out of someone in Japan, and we pull a tumor out of someone in the United States, and we look at them both under a microscope. We don't know where it comes from, right? But that's not the case with mental illness, mental distress, because if the biological narrative were true, it would have to be true across time and culture. That's the only way I can think to really find a truth in humanity, is what do all people experience all around the world? We know they all experience pain, we know that we all experience suffering, joy, but it's the interpretation of that changes the name we put on it and how we treat it. And we know that this has changed because I believe it was Zanzibar, so it was a while ago. Like if you look, there's a book called Crazy Like Us by Ethan Waters that I'm digging deep into my mental Rolodex over this. But he talks about the expression of mental illness in Japan, China, and somewhere, it's one of the Z countries in Africa. I can't remember if it was Zimbabwe, Zambia, or what it was. But it was talking about how, like, basically if you have two people who have expressions of schizophrenia in the United States and in wherever this was in Southern Africa, the way we treat it is completely different. It was comparing how one family of a schizophrenic child would really coddle that kid. There was so much fear around it. The parents would take on the stress and the obligation of taking care of this person, and that person just stayed sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker. But they compared it to a similar situation where there was a family whose child had the expression of schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is interesting because it's a lot more measurable, right? Like, we can measure when someone's in a psychotic state and hearing voices, unlike being able to measure my feelings of depression versus somebody else's. We can't do that. But in schizophrenia, it's a little easier to create data. But the strategy for the schizophrenic person in Southern Africa was full cultural support from the family and also the entire town. Like, they just said, this is just the way she is. It's something that she experiences in her family when she's having a psychotic episode. Nobody really overreacted. They're just kind of like, it's just how she is today. Like, make sure she's okay. There was also a much bigger culture and meaning around it, where there was value in this person's family about, like, she's communicating somehow with the spirit world. There's meaning in it. There's an importance to it. They respected her as having a different
That is
ability.
really African American interpretation of mental health.
Yeah,
You know.
that's similar from what you've experienced.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not one dimensional.
Exactly.
It's a community thing. It's often hybridized.
Yeah.
If there's need for some kind of medication, people go for it, but you don't just
Right.
throw the person to the pharmacist.
And the argument that Waters was making in his book is that there's so much more of a cultural acceptance of a wide variety of spiritual, emotional experience, that it's not necessarily pathological, which is a wildly different way to think about it than we have in the US. And that changed the outcome of these two people, which is the point, right? But then what we've done is we've exported our Western thinking of mental health in all around the world. And so another comparison this book made was talking about how, like, in Japan, in Japanese, they didn't really even have a word for depression. They had a lot of different expressions of distress, but it was never this kind of like pathological, helpless thing that you needed medication for. But then, and like, it was to the point where it was it GlaxoSmithKline or Lilly? I can't remember. I think they were trying to export Paxil to Japan. They couldn't find a market. People didn't understand it. They were like, this is being a human. This isn't something wrong. So they actually built the market and marketed depression. They realized instead of marketing the antidepressant to Japan, we have to market depression to Japan. And then we can come in and market antidepressants. And so this book particularly talks about how this has been exported all over the world. It also talks about eating disorders in China, very different expression of eating disorders. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Just to let you know, this is the time where some people have to go to class, because
Yes,
class is
well,
starting.
of course.
Yeah.
Go do what you're here for. So they basically like have exported this idea of mental illness all around the globe, which again speaks to me that this is not a pathological thing, because why would brains be breaking at the rate they are in the United States in a genetic pathological way, but it's not happening somewhere else? Like, we're not biologically different. So that suggests that it's culture, or it's the drugs. So that was a great question. Let's see. And then Medicating Normals in the documentary that came out, that follows the work from 5 different people, 2 vets, a young adult, and someone who's given sleeping pills and benzos because she worked as a shift worker. And it's just about the reckless prescribing that they received and their struggles to get off of these drugs.
I think we have time for maybe one more quick question. We probably should wrap up so there's time for a shift change in the classroom. But anybody have a final question for Brooke? Up here in the front?
I'm curious what you think about therapeutic options.
You know, the literature on therapeutic options is very interesting because I think most people think that a combination of antidepressants and talk therapy is going to be better than just one or the other. And the literature actually suggests that the most effective therapy is one without any sort of chemical intervention because you can't fully access the feelings and the emotion. So, thank you so much. I'm a big fan of therapeutic intervention as a temporary aid. And there's a reason why I say temporary. I think it is really, really important. One, I think that informed consent and damage can be done in therapy just as well as it can be done by drugs. There are plenty of therapists who have irrevocably harmed their patients accidentally. But a reason why that can happen is in part because there's a really interesting power dynamic between therapists and patients. It's a very odd conflict of interest that I don't really see a way around. If you're paying someone to make you better, what is their incentive to have you stop? Which I find to be a little interesting. I think also sometimes there can be a little bit too much, maybe coddling around the idea that nothing is your fault and that it's everybody else, when in fact, like, really good therapy is about turning inward and finding the answers within yourself. So I do think that there needs to be a delineation between bad therapy and good therapy. For one, not all therapy is good. Some therapy in the right context is great. And I also think that we really need to, it's extremely beneficial to put time constraints on how long you're gonna spend with someone. Like, let's say, I know for me when I was going through withdrawal, and the person that I found who I ended up working with, was very, very expensive because I was not working within the medical system at that point for obvious reasons. I felt a little burned by it. And it was like, look, we've got 16 sessions to get this done. And we basically spread that out over a year. But then when session 16 was up, we were gonna be done. So I had to be incentivized to do the work in between our sessions and to really make sure that when I showed up, I was ready to get worth out of that. Because I knew that this wasn't going to go on forever. And so I think that there's real value in putting deadlines on therapy. And that doesn't mean you can't go back later down the line, but it's a really good idea to a point to stop talking about yourself, to take the spotlight off of yourself, to go out to the world, help other people, let things integrate, realize that you are a human in this experience, and that it's not all about you, but also just give it a break. And then to use those tools when you need them for a specific purpose. As far as what modality, I don't give a shit, whatever works for you. There are 20 different modalities out there, 40, 50, try them all. I know I didn't do well with CBT, but some people love it, right? So I did well with, I did a little bit of tapping, I like that. I ended up more in a kind of a Eastern, Western kind of Buddhist-y type thing. Worked really well for me because logic wasn't really at the forefront of my mind, it was all about emotions. That worked well for me. I've heard a lot of people have success with something called interfamily systems, which is really cool, but DBT, EMDR, whatever, who cares? Whatever works for you, that's the point. It's all just different roads to the same destination.
Please join me in thanking Brooke for sharing her expertise with us.
Thank you so much, guys. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me, or you can DM me or whatever. It's just at Brooke Siem. Again, I know everybody was here for a reason. This was very specific, so if there's something you have that you want to talk to me about, either privately or on behalf of a family member or someone you care about, please don't feel free to email me. And I really appreciate you coming. The book is available wherever books are sold. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.